a four-star American general, stood in the middle of a forward operating base carved out of red Vietnamese dirt and told the Australians, to their faces, that they were not fighting hard enough, not killing enough, not moving enough, not doing enough. The year was 1967. The general was William Childs Westmoreland, commander of all United States forces in Vietnam, the man whose photograph hung in the Pentagon alongside the president's, whose opinion on battlefield performance carried the weight of 500,000 American troops behind it. He had come to Nui Dat to see the first Australian task force for himself, the brigade-sized force that had been running its own war in Phuoc Thai province for 8 months. He watched, he listened, he toured, and then he made his pronouncement. The Australians, Westmoreland said, were very inactive, not aggressive enough, not generating the kind of enemy contact that a committed Allied force should be generating. The comment rippled through classified channels within 48 hours. By the time it reached Canberra, the Australian military establishment was operating at a temperature usually reserved for diplomatic incidents. Wait, what? The Australians had arrived in Phuoc Thai province just 8 months earlier and had already fought one of the most remarkable defensive battles of the entire war. 108 men holding off an estimated 2,000 enemy fighters in a monsoon-drenched rubber plantation. They had been running continuous platoon-level patrols 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, across 4,000 square kilometers of contested jungle and rice paddies. They had been bleeding the Viet Cong's D445 provincial battalion dry, one ambush at a time, one intelligence report at a time, with a professionalism that American observers privately described as extraordinary. And Westmoreland called them inactive? Oh, this story gets so much stranger than you think. Because what Westmoreland was really saying had nothing to do with courage or commitment or professionalism. What he was really saying was something far more revealing. He was saying that the Australians weren't fighting his war. They were fighting a completely different one. And the numbers that would come out over the following years, the kill ratios, the reduction in enemy activity, the security assessments, the captured Viet Cong documents, would demonstrate, with the kind of cold precision that generals hate and historians love, who had been right. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you will understand why the smallest Allied contingent in Vietnam achieved results that the largest military machine in American history could not replicate. And you will understand why a word spoken by a general in 1967 became, decades later, the perfect summary of everything that went wrong. The word aggressive had a very specific meaning in the United States Army of 1966 and 1967. It meant visible, it meant loud, it meant contact. It meant the kind of operations that showed up in morning briefings as red pins on green maps, a company-sized sweep here, a battalion search and destroy there, helicopter insertions at first light, artillery concentrations at dusk. It meant body count, not the subtle, grinding, invisible pressure of small unit patrolling that denied the enemy freedom of movement over months and seasons. Not the patient intelligence collection that told you where the enemy would be next week rather than where he was right now. Not the ambush positions that sat silent for days in triple canopy jungle until the enemy walked into them and were destroyed with clinical precision. Those things didn't look aggressive by American standards. They didn't generate the kind of statistics that American division commanders were required to report upward every 24 hours. And in Westmoreland's Vietnam, if it didn't appear in the statistics, it didn't exist. This was the cultural machinery that the first Australian task force had deliberately chosen not to plug into. And to understand why they made that choice, you have to go back further than Vietnam. You have to go back to a different jungle, a different decade, and a lesson written in the blood of Australian soldiers that their American counterparts had never been forced to learn. The Malayan emergency ran from 1948 to 1960, and it was the crucible that produced the entire Australian military doctrine applied in Vietnam. The British Army had entered Malaya expecting to apply conventional military thinking against communist guerrillas operating in dense jungle, large sweeps, firepower dominance, the methodical grinding down of enemy formations through superior numbers and resources. It worked the way conventional thinking usually works against a guerrilla opponent. Which is to say, it didn't work at all. The guerrillas dissolved before contact, reconstituted after it, and returned to the same villages and supply routes the moment the sweeping columns had passed through. The jungle absorbed everything the British threw at it and gave nothing back. The lesson that emerged from the emergency, slowly and painfully through a dozen years of trial and modification, was that counterinsurgency in dense jungle required something European military culture was constitutionally uncomfortable with. It required patience. It required the willingness to operate in very small groups, to move very slowly, to remain in the jungle for extended periods without resupply or significant support, to gather intelligence through observation rather than through the blunt instrument of aggressive patrolling. It required treating the civilian population not as a background against which military operations were conducted, but as the actual center of gravity of the entire conflict, because a guerrilla who lost the support of his civilian base eventually lost his food, his intelligence, his recruits, and his will to continue. General Sir Gerald Templar, who commanded British forces in Malaya from 1952 onwards, coined the phrase that would define the doctrine. The answer lies not in pouring more troops into the jungle, he said, but in the hearts and minds of the Malayan people. Australian soldiers had fought in Malaya. They had absorbed those lessons. When Australia entered the Indonesian confrontation in Borneo from 1963 to 1966, they applied the same principles in an even more demanding environment, operating in small teams along an impossible jungle frontier with a combination of stealth and precision that earned them enormous respect from British commanders who had seen professional soldiers operating at every level of competence. By the time the first Australians arrived in Vietnam, the officers and NCOs leading them had direct operational experience with exactly the kind of conflict they were being asked to fight. They were not starting from theory. They were applying practice. Westmoreland had none of this background. He was a product of a different. The World War II inflected American Army of the 1950s and early 1960s, a tradition built around firepower, mobility, mass, and the decisive engagement. He had commanded the 101st Airborne Division, studied at Harvard Business School, served as Army Chief of Staff before Vietnam. He was by every conventional American measure a superb officer, but his entire professional formation had taught him one fundamental truth about war: you win by finding the enemy and destroying him with superior force. In Vietnam, where the enemy moved like water, that truth would prove corrosive. He arrived in Vietnam in 1964 and inherited a situation already deteriorating. The Viet Cong were expanding. The South Vietnamese army was struggling. American advisors were dying. His response, and it was a response that made perfect military sense given his doctrine, was to escalate, to introduce ground troops, to find the enemy's main force units and engage them in the kind of large unit battles where American firepower superiority would produce decisive results. To measure progress through the crossover point, the moment when American forces were killing enemy fighters faster than North Vietnam and the Viet Cong could replace them. Body count was not a choice or a preference. It was the logical quantification of a strategy built on attrition. Kill enough of them, and they quit. The problem that the Australians had understood from the beginning, and that Westmoreland never fully absorbed, was that the enemy in Vietnam did not respond to that logic. North Vietnam's leadership was not calculating the ratio of soldiers killed against some threshold of acceptable loss and planning to sue for peace when the number was exceeded. They were fighting a war of national unification that they had already been fighting in various forms for 20 years, first against the Japanese, then against the French, now against the Americans. Ho Chi Minh had made the calculus explicit in 1946 in a statement directed at the French that would prove equally applicable to everyone who came after. You can kill 10 of our men for every one we kill of yours, but even at those odds, you will lose and we will win. The Vietnamese communist leadership was prepared to absorb losses on a scale that no American wargaming scenario had ever seriously contemplated. Body count, as a strategic instrument, was measuring exactly the wrong thing. But here in 1967, none of that was yet the consensus view. Westmoreland was the supreme commander. He had the authority. And the Australians, operating in their small coastal province, with their quiet patrols and their careful ambushes and their stubborn refusal to generate the kind of body count statistics that American briefers demanded, were a very visible anomaly in his war. The task force commander who bore the brunt of Westmoreland's very inactive assessment was Brigadier Stuart Graham, a professional soldier with combat experience in Korea and a deep personal investment in the methods his soldiers were using. Graham's response, delivered through official channels with the kind of controlled fury that Commonwealth military correspondents had elevated to an art form, was factual, methodical, and devastating. He laid out the statistics. His task force had been in country for 8 months. They had conducted continuous operations across the entire province. They had achieved a kill ratio, the ratio of enemy killed to own casualties, that exceeded 10-1. They had degraded the D-445 Provincial Battalion to the point where the unit was actively avoiding contact with Australian forces in its own operational area. And they had done all of this while sustaining the lowest casualty rate of any comparable Allied force in Vietnam. Not lowest because they were hiding, lowest because their methods were working. Graham's central point was not that the Australians were killing fewer enemy soldiers than Westmoreland wanted. His central point was that body count was the wrong metric for the kind of war being fought in Phuoc Thai province. What mattered was not how many Viet Cong you killed on Tuesday. What mattered was whether the Viet Cong could operate freely in the province on Thursday, next month, next year. And by that measure, the actual strategic measure that determined whether the war was being won or lost, the Australians were winning. The disagreement was not personal. Both men were professional soldiers doing what their doctrine told them was right. But their doctrines were pointing in opposite directions, and only one of them could be pointing toward victory. 2 years earlier, on the 18th of August 1966, the Australians had demonstrated something important about what their doctrine looked like when it was tested to the breaking point. Delta Company, 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, had gone out on a routine patrol that morning from the task force base at Nui Dat. Their mission was to follow up a mortar attack that had hit the base the previous day and locate the enemy fire positions in the Long Tan rubber plantation a few kilometers to the east. 108 men went out into that plantation. They had no reason to expect anything other than a standard follow-up patrol. What they found instead was approximately 1,500 to 2,500 enemy fighters. Estimates vary. The Viet Cong counts differ from Australian counts, but everyone agrees the ratio was roughly 18 or 20 to 1 from the 275th Regiment combined with the D4 Fort 5 Provincial Battalion, moving in prepared formation through the same rubber plantation. The battle that followed lasted nearly 4 hours in a monsoon rain so heavy that it turned the red laterite soil into ankle-deep mud and reduced visibility to meters. What happened at Long Tan was not a product of raw courage alone, though the courage was real and it was extraordinary. It was a product of Australian military training applied under the most extreme pressure. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers made independent tactical decisions without waiting for higher command guidance, because Australian doctrine trained leadership at every level of the rank structure to make decisions under fire rather than refer upward. Artillery coordination between Delta Company's forward observers and the guns back at Nui Dat was practiced and precise. Shells were called in so close to Australian positions that fragments wounded Australian soldiers, because the alternative was being overrun. Individual marksmanship was maintained at a standard that American observers consistently found remarkable, because Australian infantry training operated on the assumption that small units would face larger enemy forces and that every shot needed to count in a way that American ammunition logistics, with their abundant resupply, made unnecessary. When Australian armored personnel carriers finally broke through to relieve the company after 4 hours, the battlefield fell silent under the continuing rain. The next morning, 245 enemy bodies were counted in the plantation. Australian casualties were 18 killed and 24 wounded. The ratio was extraordinary. It was also, from the Australian perspective, exactly what their training was designed to produce, not necessarily that specific ratio. No one plans for the specific outcome of a battle, but the capacity to hold against overwhelming odds, maintain unit cohesion under fire, and bring combined arms to bear with enough precision and speed to prevent a numerical disparity from becoming a catastrophe. Westmoreland, to his credit, called Long Tan one of the most spectacular engagements in Vietnam to that point. He praised Australian professionalism. He understood what the battle demonstrated about the quality of the soldiers involved, but he did not connect what Long Tan demonstrated about Australian quality to what Australian methods were achieving in Phuoc Thi Province day by day, patrol by patrol, in the operations that never made it into the high-profile statistics he was reviewing. The battle was legible to him because it looked like combat. The continuous patrolling, the careful intelligence gathering, the patient ambushing, those were less legible because they didn't fit the template of activity he had been trained to recognize as war. The soldiers who most confounded American comprehension were the ones who operated in the jungle for weeks at a time without speaking above a whisper. The Special Air Service Regiment Squadron, attached to the task force, was, by any objective assessment, one of the most effective intelligence and interdiction forces operating in Vietnam on any side. 5-man patrols would insert by helicopter, then move 15 kilometers on foot from the insertion point specifically to defeat any enemy surveillance of landing zones, and begin operations that might run for 2 to 3 weeks without resupply, without significant radio communication, without any of the support infrastructure that American special operations considered the baseline minimum for. Extended operations. They called themselves the SAS, The Viet Cong called them something else. In intelligence documents and operational orders captured throughout the war, Communist forces referred to the Australian Special Operations Troops as Ma Rung, jungle ghosts, phantoms of the forest. It was not a casual nickname. It reflected a genuine tactical reality that the Viet Cong had been forced to acknowledge through painful experience. Australian SAS patrols moved through jungle where other soldiers made noise. They established observation positions within meters of Viet Cong trails and watched enemy movement for days without being detected. When they struck from ambush positions chosen after days of observation, with every tactical advantage that patient intelligence could produce, and were gone before the enemy could mount a coherent response. And when they chose not to strike, when the intelligence value of remaining undetected outweighed the tactical value of an ambush, they simply watched, and recorded, and reported. And the information they carried back to Nui Dat built a picture of enemy activity in Phuoc Thi province that no amount of large unit sweeping could have produced. The SAS selection process had filtered for a specific psychological profile that the American Army had never attempted to define: the capacity for extended stillness, the patience to remain in one observation position for 30 hours without movement, the psychological comfort with total isolation, with the knowledge that help, if anything went wrong, was days away and might never come at all, the willingness to move at a pace that infantry soldiers trained for speed found almost physically painful. Selection assessed endurance through tests that simulated these conditions, not because the test designers were sadists, though some candidates might have disagreed, but because they were selecting for the exact psychological equipment the operational environment required. Men who could not be still could not operate. Men who could not be patient would compromise a patrol. The jungle didn't forgive impatience, and the SAS selection process was designed to ensure that the jungle never had to. American long-range reconnaissance patrol teams operated on different principles. Their missions typically lasted 3 to 7 days. They maintained regular radio contact and could call in fire support. They extracted immediately upon contact with enemy forces, because extraction under fire was preferable to a firefight with an unknown enemy strength at a time and place not of their choosing. The philosophy was sound: get in, gather intelligence about specific targets, get out, and let air power or artillery do the destruction. The problem was that 3 to 7 days of observation produced a snapshot. Australian SAS operations over 2 to 3 weeks produced something closer to a film, a continuous record of enemy patterns, routines, routes, caches, leadership locations, and supply schedules that made the enemy's behavior predictable in a way that no snapshot could achieve. Predictable enemy behavior meant you could position forces not where the enemy was, but where the enemy would be. And that distinction between reactive and proactive military intelligence was the difference between spending a war chasing an enemy who always seemed to be one step ahead, and spending a war waiting for an enemy who kept walking into your ambushes. The man who would deliver the second major American critique of Australian methods, and who would manage to be even less qualified to deliver it than Westmoreland, arrived in Phuoc Thi province in 1969. Lieutenant General Julian Ewell had commanded the 9th Infantry Division in the Mekong Delta before assuming command of 2 Field Force Vietnam, the largest American Army combat command in country. His command philosophy was both straightforward and brutal. The most important measure of success was enemy killed per day. More specifically, enemy killed per unit per day, calibrated against the size of each unit and the time they had been in their operational area. By Ewell's mathematics, units that weren't killing enough enemy were either avoiding contact or not trying hard enough. Ewell visited Fuoktui Province and pronounced it a disaster. Enemy activity had dropped by a substantial margin compared to 1966 levels. D-445 Battalion had been so severely degraded that it was operating at a fraction of its former strength. Main force Viet Cong units had largely withdrawn from the province into border areas. Road security on Route 15, the main supply corridor between Vung Tau and Saigon, had improved measurably. Government presence had extended into villages that had been effectively Viet Cong controlled 3 years earlier. By any assessment that was not purely about enemy killed per day, Phuoc Thi Province was one of the better performing areas of operations in South Vietnam. Ewell looked at all of this and saw insufficient body count, which meant failure. The Australian response to Ewell was less restrained than the response to Westmoreland had been, because by 1969 Australian commanders had been having this conversation for 3 years and had run out of patience for arguing the same points in slightly different language. One Australian officer, in private correspondence that would be quoted in post-war analysis for a generation, distilled the disagreement to its irreducible core. American generals, he wrote, wanted to win Vietnam by killing every Vietnamese who opposed them. The Australians wanted to win by making the civilian population prefer the government side to the communist side. These were not compatible strategies, and the Australian task force was not going to abandon a strategy that was working in order to satisfy an American general's statistics. The irony that Ewell's own operational record carried was enormous. His 9th Infantry Division's Operation Speedy Express, conducted in the Mekong Delta from December 1968 to May 1969, reported an official enemy body count of nearly 11,000 fighters killed. Investigators later determined that only 748 weapons were seized during the same period, a disparity so vast it could only be explained by one of two things. Either the 9th Division was fighting an enemy army that had somehow misplaced its rifles, or a significant portion of those 11,000 bodies were civilians. Internal Department of Defense assessments estimated that up to 7,000 of the dead may have been non-combatants. The operation that served as Ewell's template for aggressive action, the operation that he held up as the example of what proper body count looked like, had, in the judgment of the Army's own investigators, produced one of the largest single accumulations of civilian casualties in the entire war. This was the man who came to Phuoc Thi Province and told the Australians they weren't doing enough. History would record the comparison with a dry, unsparing clarity. The deeper argument, the argument that neither Westmoreland's very inactive nor Ewell's statistics critique could quite reach, was about what winning actually meant in Phuoc Thi Province. This is where the Australian position was most clearly vindicated by events, and most clearly misunderstood by the Americans at the time. The Viet Cong were not simply a military force. They were a political and military force, and the distinction mattered enormously. They maintained an infrastructure in every district of Phuoc Thi Province: tax collectors, intelligence agents, village-level political cadres, courier networks, recruitment cells. This infrastructure was not destroyed by killing fighters in ambushes. You could kill every fighter D-445 battalion sent into the field, and the political infrastructure would simply recruit and train more fighters, because the infrastructure that sustained them remained intact. This was why Templar's hearts and minds formulation from the Malayan emergency had been so important, not because it was a nice-sounding phrase, but because it identified the correct objective. The objective was not the enemy's fighters. The objective was the civilian population whose support made the enemy's fighters possible. Australian operations in Fuak Tui addressed both dimensions simultaneously, with imperfect results but genuine effort. Infantry battalions patrolled not just to find and kill Viet Cong, but to establish a persistent presence that denied the enemy freedom of movement and demonstrated to the civilian population that the government side could be there, in their villages, on a regular basis, without the rapid disappearance that characterized American operations. Civil affairs teams worked alongside military units, rebuilding infrastructure, supporting medical care, engaging district chiefs and village councils in the political work that military operations alone could never accomplish. The SAS intelligence picture built a detailed understanding of the Viet Cong infrastructure, not just its military units, but its political network, that could be acted on with precision. And the Australian approach to contact with the civilian population was calibrated, consciously and continuously, to leave behind a different impression than the impression left by large-scale American operations that swept through areas, dominated them briefly with enormous firepower, and then departed. None of this showed up in body count statistics. It was never going to show up in body count statistics, because it wasn't that kind of warfare. It was the other kind, the kind that could only be measured over years in the gradual extension of government authority into previously contested territory, in the slowly declining frequency of enemy-initiated incidents, in the cautious reappearance of commercial activity on roads that had been ambush corridors, in the captured documents in which enemy commanders wrote about avoiding Australian areas because the cost of operating there had become unsustainable. And those documents existed. They were real. Captured North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong operational orders from 1969, 1970, and 1971 repeatedly referenced the Australian presence in Phuoc Thai province in language that had no American equivalent in any document about any American operational area. Communist forces retreated from American sectors when American firepower made holding their positions too costly, then returned when the American units moved on. Communist forces did something fundamentally different in Australian sectors. They avoided them, not because the Australians were more dangerous in the moment of contact, though the SAS's kill ratios suggested they often were, but because Australian forces didn't leave. The patrols continued. The ambushes were always possible. The intelligence picture never went stale, because the SAS was always there, watching, recording, building the next operation out of the intelligence product of the last one. An enemy who could not plan operations without the plans being disrupted, who could not move supplies without the movements being observed, who could not hold meetings without the meeting locations becoming ambush sites, that enemy eventually stopped operating. Not because he had been killed, because continued operations had become rationally unsustainable. One captured operations order from a North Vietnamese Army regiment in 1971 contained a passage that served as a more honest assessment of Australian operational effectiveness than anything produced by an American general inspecting Phuoc Thai province. When fighting the Americans, the document said, enemy forces should select advantageous ground, engage when the conditions favored them, and withdraw when conditions were unfavorable. When fighting the Australians, the document said simply, avoid contact where possible. The Australians were patient hunters who did not clear an area and leave. They remained indefinitely. Long-term operations in their area were not possible. That document, written by an enemy commander who had no reason to flatter the Australians, was a more accurate operational assessment of what the 1st Australian Task Force had achieved in Phuoc Tai Province than anything in Westmoreland's after-action reports or Ewell's body count spreadsheets. The statistical record of the task force's 6-year presence in Phuoc Tai Province requires careful handling because the numbers that exist come from multiple sources with varying degrees of reliability, and honest analysis has to acknowledge that Australian methods did not produce perfect results. The Viet Cong political infrastructure was never fully dismantled. When Australian forces withdrew in 1971 as part of the Nixon Doctrine's broader disengagement, that infrastructure began expanding back into the province almost immediately, and Phuoc Tai would eventually be absorbed into the unified Vietnam along with the rest of the South. The Australians pacified a province they were not permitted to hold forever. Their methods worked for as long as they were present and sustained, and could not work without that presence. That is a genuine limitation, and any assessment that ignores it is incomplete. But it is also the wrong frame for evaluating what the task force achieved. The question is not whether the Australians permanently solved the security problem in Phuoc Tai Province. No Allied force permanently solved any security problem in Vietnam, because the war ultimately ended in the way it ended, and the outcome of a war is a political determination as much as a military one. The question is whether the Australians achieved better operational results with their methods than would have been achieved with American methods. And the answer to that question, across every metric that actually measures counterinsurgency effectiveness, appears to be yes. By 1969, enemy-initiated incidents in the province had dropped substantially from 1966 levels. D445 Battalion, the Viet Cong's primary provincial military force in Phuoc Tai, had been degraded to a fraction of its former capability through sustained Australian operations. The road network had become significantly safer. The main force Viet Cong units that had operated freely in the province's jungle redoubts, the Long Hai Mountains, the Mai Tao complex, had been pushed to the margins or into hiding. Route 15, between Vung Tau and Saigon, showed declining attack rates that reflected real security gains on the ground, and the task force had achieved all of this while sustaining a casualty rate substantially below comparable Allied forces in comparable operational environments. The Australians were not fighting a low-intensity war. They were fighting the same war that American units were fighting elsewhere in South Vietnam. They were just producing different results with different methods. The American military would eventually, grudgingly, and at great cost in other conflicts, absorb the lessons the Australians had been demonstrating since 1966. The counterinsurgency doctrine that reshaped American military thinking after Iraq and Afghanistan, the emphasis on population security over enemy body count, the recognition that winning the war among the people matters more than winning firefights in the jungle, the understanding that persistent presence is worth more than temporary firepower dominance. These ideas were not new in 2003 or 2007. They had been articulated by Templer in 1952 and demonstrated by the Australians in Vietnam from 1966 to 1971. American military culture simply could not bring itself to learn from a force 1/60th its size that operated quietly in one coastal province and declined to engage on American terms. It took 2 more failed wars to force the lesson through, and the lesson, when it finally arrived in U.S. Army field manuals, said things that Australian veterans of Phuoc Tai Province would have recognized immediately. The story of Westmoreland's very inactive comment, and everything that surrounds it, is really a story about 2 different definitions of the word aggressive. The American definition was visible, loud, numerically large, and oriented toward contact. You were aggressive if you went out and found the enemy and killed him today. The Australian definition was patient, persistent, oriented toward understanding, and aimed at degradation over time. You were aggressive if you made it impossible for the enemy to plan, move, or operate without being disrupted or destroyed, not necessarily today, but consistently, week after week, season after season, until operating in your area of responsibility became too costly to contemplate. One of those definitions produced a war of enormous firepower, enormous casualties on all sides, enormous expenditure of resources, and ultimately a failure to achieve its strategic objectives. The other produced Phuoc Thi Province in 1969, a place where the enemy feared to operate, where civilian life had cautiously returned to roads and markets that had been Viet Cong corridors 3 years earlier, where a relatively small professional force had achieved measurable, real security gains through the disciplined application of a doctrine that had been refined over decades and tested in Malaya and Borneo before it arrived. The word aggressive is, in the end, a question about intent. What are you trying to accomplish? Westmoreland was trying to kill enough enemy fighters to reach the crossover point, the statistical moment when replacement could not keep up with attrition. It was a coherent goal. It was simply the wrong goal. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army were never going to run out of fighters before American public opinion ran out of patience. The numbers were not going to go the right way. You could not attrit your way to victory against an enemy whose strategic resilience had been shaped by 25 years of continuous warfare and whose political will to continue was essentially limitless. The Australians were trying to accomplish something more modest and, as it turned out, more achievable. They were trying to make Phuoc Thi Province governable, to degrade the enemy's capacity to operate there to the point where government authority could function, trade could move, civilians could live with some reasonable expectation of safety. They were not trying to destroy North Vietnam. They were not trying to win the war by themselves. They were trying to accomplish the specific mission they had been given in the specific province that was their responsibility, using methods suited to that mission. And they succeeded, imperfectly, conditionally, within the limits of what any military force can accomplish in a war that ultimately turns on political decisions made in capitals thousands of kilometers away. But they succeeded. The enemy said so themselves in captured documents that remain in archives and say, with the blunt candor of operational orders that were never meant to be read by the people they described, that the Australians were patient hunters who did not leave, and that their areas were to be avoided. When Westmoreland said very inactive in January 1967, he was describing soldiers who were at that moment in the jungle 24 hours a day, running patrols that never appeared in his statistics, building an intelligence picture that would sustain operations for years, maintaining a pressure on enemy forces that was as invisible as it was relentless. He was wrong about what he was seeing. He was not wrong to look. He was the commander, and it was his responsibility to assess every Allied force in his area. But he was wrong in the most fundamental way a commander can be wrong. He was looking at the right soldiers doing the right things and misreading everything he saw, because his doctrine told him that what he was looking at was not war. History has a particular way of adjudicating these disagreements. It waits for the results. And the results in Phuoc Thi Province between 1966 and 1971 were written in declining enemy activity reports, in captured operational orders, in the assessment of Australian military officers who had watched their methods work in 2 previous theaters before they brought them to Vietnam, and in the honest testimony of an enemy commander who had no reason to flatter anyone. The jungle ghosts were real, the patient hunters were winning, and the general who called them inactive had, without knowing it, offered the most backhanded confirmation of their effectiveness that history would ever produce. They were doing something he couldn't recognize as war, but the enemy could recognize it. And the enemy was afraid of it. That is the verdict. Not from Australian archives, not from the post-war assessments of scholars sympathetic to the Commonwealth position, not from the memoirs of the men who were there, from the enemy, from the people who were on the receiving end of every quiet patrol, every invisible ambush, every SAS observation post established within meters of a Viet Cong trail in a jungle that the Viet Cong believed they owned. From the operational orders that said avoid these soldiers, do not engage them in their area, their presence makes long-term operations impossible. From the intelligence documents that gave them a name, Ma Rung, jungle ghosts, that captured, in 2 words in a language those soldiers didn't speak, everything that Westmoreland's statistics could never see. "You are not being aggressive enough," said the general. The jungle disagreed.